Hello there. You're here now, and you're safe. You don't need to do anything. You don't need to be anywhere. This is just a place to rest and to listen. Let your eyes soften. Let your body sink into wherever you are. Let your breath come slowly in and out. We're about to take a journey together, a soft one, quiet. Just a slow unfolding of one of the biggest stories in American history, told not with urgency, but with calm. This is the story of the American Civil War told in a way that helps you rest. Not a lecture, and not a loud history class, just a gentle walk through time. Long before smartphones and highways, before electricity and before airplanes, before modern cities rose and the world felt so fast, there was a quieter America. One still building itself, still figuring out what it wanted to be. And from that quiet came a storm. But don't worry, we're not rushing toward that storm. We're just setting the stage, one candlelit room at a time, one horse-drawn path at a time, one soft, steady breath at a time. This video is here to help you wind down, to close your eyes, drift away, and let your imagination wander gently through the past. We're going to move through history together, not to memorize facts, but to feel the rhythm of a time long gone. You'll hear about presidents and generals, but you'll also hear about farmers, about letters sent from faraway camps, about the slow grind of daily life during a very different kind of America. We won't rush. We'll go slowly, one step at a time. The American Civil War happened over 160 years ago, from 1861 to 1865. It was a painful, complicated, and powerful moment in U.S. history, a time when the country still young turned on itself. But even though it was a war, this isn't a story about just fighting. It's a story about change, about identity, about what it means to belong, and about what happens when a country has to choose what kind of future it wants. For now, though, you don't need to worry about the details. The names, the battles, the dates, those will come gently later. Right now, just let your body relax, let your thoughts float, and imagine a quieter America, one of candlelight and cold winters, of handwritten letters and wooden porches, of horses, newspapers, and songs sung by firelight. This is where we begin. In the chapters ahead, you'll hear about the rise of tension between the North and South, about the people who tried to stop it, and the ones who pushed it forward. You'll walk through early battles. You'll hear how people lived, not just soldiers, but mothers, workers, children, freedmen, and those still enslaved. You'll feel the weight of big decisions and the quiet heartbreak that lingered after each. And slowly, you'll see how the country bent, but did not break. And all the while, you'll be drifting deeper into calm. Each section will guide you further, into rest. So don't worry if you fall asleep along the way. That's what this is for. History will wait for you. And if you need to come back to it later, you can. For now, all you need to do is breathe and listen. Because we're about to begin. Softly, gently. Welcome to the story of the American Civil War, told the quiet way. Before war, before rifles were raised and banners were sown, America looked peaceful. Mostly. On the surface, it was still one country, still united. Still building, growing, stretching across rivers and mountain ranges. But underneath, something was shifting. The year is 1800. The United States is only 24 years old. Still young, still figuring itself out, but already restless. The Atlantic coast was full of life, cities like Boston, Philadelphia, and New York buzzing with trade and industry. But the rest of the map? Wide open. Mostly blank, full of wilderness and promise, So Americans moved west. Families packed wagons, farmers looked for land, and dreamers looked for gold, freedom, or something new. And with every mile, the country grew in population, in ambition, and intention. Because there were really two Americas now. The North was changing fast. Cities growing taller. Factories humming through the night. Railroads slicing across states. The Industrial Revolution had arrived, and with it came smokestacks, steel, wages, and wage workers. People in the North lived closer together, moved faster, read newspapers, debated in coffee houses. Many immigrants, especially from Ireland and Germany, flooded into ports looking for work and a better life. Labor was paid, mobility was possible, and most people didn't own slaves. But the South was different. Slower, wider, quieter in sound, but heavier in legacy. Massive plantations spread across warm, fertile land. Cotton was king, and to grow that cotton, millions of enslaved people were forced to work. Men, women, and children, bought and sold, owned, families torn apart. Lives controlled not by time clocks but by chains and commands. It was a system, a brutal one, and for the South, it was seen as necessary. Slavery was deeply woven into the Southern economy, not just as labor, but as wealth. Enslaved people were counted as assets worth more in total than all the railroads and banks in the country combined. So while the North and South shared a name, United States, they were growing into two very different worlds. And every time America grew, every time it added new land, the same question came up. Would this new land allow slavery? Would it be a free state or a slave state? That simple question carried heavy consequences. If the South gained more slave states, it would have more power in Congress. If the North gained more free states, it could push to end slavery altogether. Both sides feared the other. Both sides believed the stakes were existential. And so, the Great Balancing Act began. In 1820, Congress passed the Missouri Compromise. Missouri would enter as a slave state. Maine would enter as a free state. Balance preserved. But more importantly, a line was drawn. A literal line across the map. North of it, no slavery. South of it, slavery permitted. It seemed like a solution, a quiet compromise. But it was only a pause button. Not a fix, not even close, because Americans kept moving west, and every new state reopened the wound. Then came Texas, then California, then the vast lands taken after the Mexican-American War. Each one reignited the debate. Each one made the country hold its breath. And with every compromise came more cracks. In the South, there was growing resentment. They saw the North as judgmental, arrogant, and meddling. They believed their way of life, their economy, was under attack. In the North, there was growing frustration. More people began to speak out against slavery. Abolitionists wrote books, held speeches, published newspapers. And while not every Northerner wanted to end slavery entirely, more and more felt uncomfortable with its expansion. But no one, not even the boldest voices, truly believed war was coming. Not yet. They believed in deals, in laws, in time, that somehow the center would hold. It was a strange kind of optimism, like watching smoke from under a door, but believing there's no fire. Still, the warnings were there. Whispers, flickers. Moments that in hindsight feel like loud alarms. In 1831, a man named Nat Turner led a rebellion in Virginia, an enslaved preacher who saw visions and took up arms. The rebellion was crushed, brutally. And in response, Southern states tightened their slave laws even more. In 1848, the Free Soil Party formed. Their slogan was simple: free soil, free speech, free labor, and free men. They didn't call for abolition everywhere, but they drew a line. No new slave states. Then came Uncle Tom's Cabin, a novel, written by Harriet Beecher Stowe in 1852. It sold hundreds of thousands of copies. It painted slavery as cruel, dehumanizing, evil. And for many in the North, it was a wake-up call. For many in the South, it was an insult. The cultural divide was now not just economic, but emotional. And through it all, the federal government tried to keep the peace. Carefully, cautiously, balancing on a tightrope. But tightropes don't last forever, and balance doesn't mean unity. By the mid-1850s, the ground had shifted. A new political party had emerged, the Republican Party, formed almost entirely to stop the spread of slavery. Its support came mostly from the North. Meanwhile, in the South, people were talking about secession, leaving the Union more openly. It had been an idea before. Now, it was a threat. And the gap was no longer just about economics. It was about identity, about who got to decide what America meant. So here we are. By the end of the 1850s, America is still united, still flying one flag, still passing laws, still holding elections. But the tension, it's thick enough to cut with a knife. People smiled in public and whispered in private. Newspapers sharpened their tone. Churches split. Families disagreed at dinner tables. It was a cold war of ideas, waiting to get hot. And the quiet question beneath it all still hadn't gone away. Can a house divided still stand? Soon that question would be answered. Not in words, not in laws, but in battlefields, letters, fires, and flags. But for now, in these years before the storm, America remained whole, barely. So rest here, in this calm before the thunder. The sky is darkening, but the first drops haven't fallen yet. Tomorrow, we step into the storm. History doesn't always announce itself with drums. Sometimes it begins with a signature, a quiet vote, a line drawn on a map, a man with a pen who thinks he's keeping peace, but really he's lighting a fuse. This is where the war truly begins, not with bullets, but with paper. The year is 1854. Congress debates a new proposal, a bill to organize two vast, unsettled territories, Kansas and Nebraska. But there's a problem. A quiet, simmering, ever-present problem. Will these territories allow slavery? The Missouri Compromise passed decades earlier had said no. It had drawn a clear line. Above this line, free. Below it, slave. Kansas and Nebraska? They were above that line. They were supposed to be free. But Senator Stephen A. Douglas had another idea. He wanted something called popular sovereignty. Let the settlers vote. Let the people decide for themselves. On paper, it sounded fair, democratic, even noble. But in reality, it opened the floodgates. The Kansas-Nebraska Act passed. And just like that, the old balance was broken. The Missouri Compromise undone. And with it, the last fragile thread of calm. Now people rushed into Kansas, not for gold, not for land, but for power. Pro-slavery settlers came from Missouri, armed and angry. Anti-slavery families arrived from the North with hope and determination. Each side trying to outnumber the other. Trying to claim Kansas for their cause. And soon, the conflict turned violent. Homes were burned. Towns attacked. People murdered in their sleep. In a land that was supposed to be peaceful, supposed to be farmland, blood now soaked the soil. This was bleeding Kansas, and it was no longer just politics. It was war on a smaller scale, but with very real casualties. Newspapers on both sides exploded with outrage. North blamed South. South blamed North. and the rest of the country watched, uneasy. The idea of compromise was dying. Then, in 1857, came a decision. One case, one courtroom, one man's fate, and with it the fate of the entire country. His name was Dred Scott. He was an enslaved man. His owner had taken him into free territory. When they returned to Missouri, Scott sued for his freedom. He argued that once he had set foot on free soil, he should no longer be a slave. The case reached the Supreme Court. 9 justices, 9 robes, one nation holding its breath. And then the ruling came. Dred Scott was not a citizen, they said. He had no right to sue. In fact, no black person in America, free or enslaved, was a citizen. And more than that, Congress had no authority to ban slavery anywhere. Not in Kansas. Not in Nebraska. Not anywhere. The message was clear. Slavery could spread wherever it wanted. The federal government couldn't stop it. The North was stunned. The South celebrated. And the line between them grew sharper. In the shadows of all this, a new political party was forming. Quiet at first, then louder, then unignorable. It was called the Republican Party, and its central belief was simple. No new slave states, not abolition, at least not yet, but no more expansion. The party attracted Northerners, former Whigs, abolitionists, and free soilers. They were businessmen, farmers, teachers, ordinary people. But they shared one fear, that slavery would take over the entire country if left unchecked. And in 1856, they ran their first presidential candidate. He didn't win, but he made a strong showing. And suddenly, the South was paying attention, because the North now had a party, a strong one, a growing one. And it wasn't afraid to say no to slavery. But no one was louder than John Brown. He wasn't a politician. He wasn't looking for votes. He was looking for justice. And he believed justice required fire. Brown had already fought in bleeding Kansas. He had already killed. But in 1859, he planned something bigger. He and a small band of followers, just 22 men, decided to take over a federal arsenal in Harper's Ferry, Virginia. His goal? Start a slave uprising, arm enslaved people, march across the South, end slavery by force. He believed God was on his side. That action was the only answer. That waiting had failed. On the night of October 16th, they struck. They captured the arsenal. But the uprising never came. The townspeople fought back. Then the Marines arrived, led by a young officer named Robert E. Lee. Brown was captured, tried, and sentenced to hang. Before his execution, he wrote these words: I, John Brown, am now quite certain that the crimes of this guilty land will never be purged away, but with blood. And when he was hanged, the country trembled. The North saw him as a martyr. The South saw him as a terrorist. But no one could ignore him. After John Brown, there was no more illusion of peace. Churches began to split. Political parties fractured. Families divided at the dinner table. The Democratic Party, which had once dominated politics, broke in two: Northern Democrats and Southern Democrats. The Republican Party grew stronger, especially in the North. And the South? It began to prepare, not for debate, not for more compromise, but for something darker. By 1860, the sky was no longer just cloudy. It was full of thunder. America wasn't just disagreeing. It was unraveling, not with a scream, but with a whisper, turning into a shout. And still, no one thought the war would actually happen. Not really, not yet. But they could feel it. In church sermons, in newspapers, in whispered conversations on porches, in the way neighbors stopped trusting each other, in the way Southern militias began to drill. In the way Northern abolitionists stopped apologizing, it was coming, slowly, inevitably, like a storm. You can see on the horizon, even if the wind hasn't hit your face yet. So rest here, at the edge of history, the last breaths before the break. The fuse is lit, the air is tense, and the country, though still technically whole, is ready to split. The next chapter begins with a name. A tall man with a beard, elected by a divided nation and destined to walk straight into the fire. But for now, let the quiet rumble rock you to sleep. The storm will wait until morning. The year is 1860. The United States is tired. Tired of shouting, tired of compromise, tired of pretending that everything is fine, when it clearly isn't. The tension that had built for decades, through compromises, decisions, rebellions, and raids, was now thick enough to feel in the air. And in the middle of it all came an election, a quiet vote, cast on paper, counted in silence, but with consequences that would echo louder than any cannon. The man at the center was Abraham Lincoln. He wasn't born into wealth. He hadn't gone to an elite school. He had a calm voice, a tall frame, and a mind that could cut through clutter like a blade through smoke. He was from Illinois. He had debated slavery publicly. He had spoken against its expansion, not against the South itself, but against the spread of a system he believed was wrong. To the North, he was a symbol of principle. To the South, he was a warning sign. He wasn't on the ballot in 10 Southern states. And still, he won. Not because the whole country voted for him, but because the country was deeply divided and Lincoln had won the North. And in that moment, everything changed. Southern leaders didn't wait. They didn't see Lincoln as a politician. They saw him as a threat, a sign that the tide was turning, and their way of life was next. And for the South, that way of life wasn't just cotton fields or front porches. It was slavery. Their economy depended on it. Their social structure was built around it. And now, a man who opposed its expansion sat at the edge of the White House. So they made a decision, a quiet, enormous, irreversible decision. South Carolina went first. Just weeks after Lincoln's election, its leaders gathered and voted to leave the Union. Not argue, not protest, leave. They believed they were exercising the right to walk away from a government they no longer trusted. They saw Lincoln not as a president for all, but as a president for the North alone. And after South Carolina, others followed. Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, Texas, one by one, like dominoes, like stars quietly fading from a flag. It was the end of something, though many didn't realize it yet. In the North, some hoped the South was bluffing, that the secession was just political theater, that cooler heads would return and unity would be restored. But in the South, there was no bluff. They were forming a new nation. They gave it a name, the Confederate States of America. They wrote a new constitution, chose their own president, and began to build an army. Meanwhile, Lincoln waited. He hadn't taken office yet. He said little publicly, but privately, he watched a country unravel. He didn't want war. He didn't want revenge. He wanted to preserve the Union, even if it meant allowing slavery where it already existed. But he would not let it expand, and he would not let the Union fall apart without a fight. Back in Washington, the government was frozen. The sitting president, James Buchanan, was still in office. But he did little to stop the secession. He believed the Constitution didn't allow states to leave Arip, but also didn't allow the government to stop them. So while debates raged, while state after state seceded, nothing was done. No troops were sent, no laws were passed, no peace was brokered. The country was breaking in real time, and the silence from the center only made it worse. Still, many Americans north and south believed there could be peace. Some thought the South would return in time. Some thought Lincoln would back down. Some believed a new compromise would come, just like the old ones. But the truth was, the ground had shifted too far. Slavery was no longer a quiet debate. It had become a defining line, a line drawn in blood, paper, and fear. The South was arming itself. The North was preparing for a crisis. And Lincoln, not yet sworn in, was already carrying the weight of a country in pieces. In early 1861, he made his way to Washington. His journey wasn't grand. It was careful, secretive even. There were whispers of plots to stop him, harm him, even kill him. But he arrived. Sworn in under cloudy skies before a fractured audience, he took the oath of office. He promised not to destroy the South. He promised not to invade. But he also promised this: the Union would not dissolve. The United States would remain. That promise would be tested within weeks. Because down in Charleston Harbor, a lonely military base, Fort Sumter, still flew the U.S. flag. It was surrounded by Confederate forces. Supplies were low. Tension was high, and everyone knew one wrong move, one single spark, and the powder keg would explode. But that spark hadn't struck yet. Not in this moment. Not quite. So we end this chapter in a strange kind of silence. Not peace, but not yet war. A president sworn in. A country split. A storm gathering. Lincoln had entered office with half a country missing. 7 states gone. More threatening to leave. The maps had changed. The rules had changed. And America was no longer united. But the first shot hadn't been fired. Not yet. So let your breath slow. Let your thoughts drift. We are now standing on the very edge of history. The final moment. Before everything shatters. In the next chapter, cannons will roar. Flags will rise, and a civil war will begin. But not just yet. For now, you can rest in the quiet just before the storm, where hope still flickers, and the last pieces of unity hang by the thinnest of threads. Sleep now. The war waits. It began not with a bang, but with a warning. Not a march of armies, not a battlefield soaked in smoke. Just a fort, sitting quietly in the harbor of Charleston, South Carolina. Fort Sumter, a small island outpost, barely armed, lightly supplied. But in April of 1861, it became the center of the American universe. Tensions had been building for months. 7 southern states had already left the Union. They had formed their own government, chosen a new leader, declared themselves separate. But one question remained. What would happen to the Union forts and military posts still sitting on southern land? The Confederacy said they belonged to the South now. The Union said otherwise. And Fort Sumter was one of those places. For weeks the fort had been surrounded. Confederate guns aimed across the water. Union soldiers trapped inside, waiting, watching, hungry. Lincoln, now president, had a choice. Send help, or give up the fort. He sent help. Food, not weapons. Supplies, not soldiers. But that gesture alone was enough. In the early morning of April 12th, 1861, cannons fired across the harbor. The first shots of the Civil War had been fired. Not at soldiers, not at cities, but at a small island fort where no one fired back for hours. The skies lit up. Shells fell like thunder. But still, the Union troops inside held their fire. They weren't there to start a war. They were just in the middle of one. The bombardment continued for over a day. Flames, shattered brick, smoke rising into the southern sky. And finally, the Union commander surrendered. No one had died during the bombardment, but something else had fallen that day. Peace. The news spread fast. Across towns and telegraphs, papers and parlors, the war had begun. In Washington, Lincoln made the decision no leader wants to make. He called for troops, 75,000 volunteers, to put down what was now seen as a rebellion. He didn't call it war, not yet. He believed the Union was still whole, just cracked, just in need of repair. But the South saw it differently. To them, this was an act of aggression, an army being raised to invade their land. And suddenly, states that had remained on the fence had to choose. Virginia was the first. It had stayed in the Union hoping war could be avoided. But after Lincoln's call for troops, it left. And with it came others. Arkansas, North Carolina, Tennessee. The Upper South, once uncertain, now fully joined the Confederacy. The line was drawn, not just in politics or philosophy, but in territory. The Confederacy now stretched from Texas to Virginia, the Union above, both sides arming, organizing, preparing, and in between, the border states. Torn, divided, undecided. Places like Kentucky, Missouri, Maryland walking a fragile line. Back in the North, thousands rushed to enlist. Young men with wide eyes and quick steps. They thought the war would be short, simple, over in weeks. Down south, it was the same. Boys became soldiers overnight. Trains filled with uniforms and hope. Each side believing they were defending something sacred. For the Union, it was the preservation of a country. For the Confederacy, it was independence. Neither side truly understood how long or how deep the struggle would become. The first battles were small. Skirmishes, cavalry tests, clashes near rivers and railroads. But the world had shifted. The country was no longer debating. It was no longer threatening. It was fighting. Brother against brother. Town against town. State against state. The Civil War had officially begun. But in these early days, there was still a strange kind of optimism. A sense that maybe this would all resolve quickly. That one strong push, one decisive victory, could end it. No one knew the scale of what was coming. The cities that would burn. The fields that would flood with blood. The inventions of destruction. The slow, grinding march across the heart of a continent. That was all ahead. For now, the war was still young. The uniforms were still clean. The flag still bright. The song still full of cheer. Fathers kissed their families goodbye, believing they'd be home by Christmas. Newspapers printed maps of battles like puzzles. Spectators brought picnic baskets to watch the first clashes, as if this were a play, not a tragedy. In the White House, Lincoln carried the weight of it all. Quietly. He read reports, spoke with generals, tried to hold the nation together piece by piece. His goal was clear. Not to conquer, but to reunite. Not to destroy the South, but to bring it back. But with every day that passed, the path forward grew darker. And down south, Confederate leaders believed history was on their side. They believed in their cause, in their rights, in their armies. They built their capital in Richmond, Virginia, just over 100 miles from Washington. Two governments, two visions, so close, and yet an ocean apart. The war had begun, not all at once, not with massive battles or blazing cities, but with a single decision, a single spark, a fort in a harbor, and a cannon in the dark. From that moment forward, there was no turning back, no more compromises, no more holding on. The Union and the Confederacy would settle their future with fire, but for now, let the cannon smoke drift gently into the sky. Let the voices of young soldiers fade softly into the fields. This is only the beginning, a war not yet defined, a nation just starting to fracture. And you can rest. Let your breathing slow. Let your thoughts settle. We are standing at the doorstep of history. And in the next chapter, the true weight of this war will begin to fall. But for now, you're safe. You're still, and sleep is yours. The war had begun, but no one quite knew how to fight it. Not really. Not the Union, not the Confederacy, and certainly not the people watching from their porches thinking the whole thing would be wrapped up by summer. Because in 1861, both sides had ideas, plans, visions of a short, clean conflict, a few key victories, a retreat or two, and then back to normal. But war never listens. In the North, the Union had the numbers. More factories, more railroads, more people, more money. It looked strong on paper, but size alone doesn't win a war. So military leaders in Washington came up with a strategy. Slow, cautious, but methodical. It was called the Anaconda Plan. Like the great serpent, it would wrap around the Confederacy. Cut it off. Squeeze it into submission. The plan was simple, in theory. Step 1. Block southern ports. Keep supplies from coming in or cotton from going out. Step 2. Take control of the Mississippi River. Split the Confederacy in half, north and south, then east and west. Step 3. Slowly advance, tighten the grip, and bring the southern states back, one by one. No massive charge, no bold invasion, just a steady, crushing embrace. But in the South, things looked different. The Confederacy didn't need to conquer anything. They didn't have to take cities or seize capitals. They just had to hold out, defend their territory, outlast the North's will to fight. It was like a child being chased, not trying to catch the pursuer, just trying not to get caught. Southern leaders believed that time was on their side, that defending their homes would give them an edge. And maybe, just maybe, the world would step in to help. You see, the South had something the world wanted: cotton. Fields and fields of it, feeding the textile mills of England, France, and beyond. Southern leaders believed that cotton was their weapon, that Europe wouldn't stand by if their factories went quiet. They hoped foreign governments would pressure the Union, force peace, or even join the war on the South side. But help didn't come. Not then. Not yet. The world watched, but it waited. So as the months passed, both sides began preparing. Soldiers were trained, supplies were gathered, maps were drawn and redrawn, and generals began to emerge. The North, with its vast industrial power, could produce guns, uniforms, and ships at incredible speed. The South had fewer factories, but strong motivation, familiar land, defensive spirit, and commanders who knew the terrain well. There were advantages and disadvantages on both sides. The Union had a larger population, more factories, a powerful navy, an established government, a working treasury. But it also had a harder mission. It had to invade and occupy a massive stretch of land. From Virginia to Texas, that was no easy task. The Confederacy, on the other hand, had shorter supply lines, experienced military leaders, Home territory advantage, a unified, passionate cause, but they lacked the North's industrial strength, and their economy was fragile, based heavily on one crop, dependent on trade, vulnerable to blockades. Still, confidence ran high and on both sides. In the North, many believed it would be over in months, that the sheer size and strength of the Union would crush the rebellion quickly. They expected one or two battles, victory parades, a reunited country. In the South, there was just as much belief that their fighting spirit would be enough, that the North would tire of war, that they could hold the line and win their independence. It was like watching two boxers step into the ring, each certain they'd win in the first round. But war isn't a game, and this one was just getting started. As 1861 rolled into 1862, strategies turned into action. The Union Navy began its blockade, slowly choking off the southern coastline. Confederate troops dug in, forts were built, defenses prepared, but still, both sides thought it wouldn't last long. There was an innocence to these early days, a sense that war could still be organized, civil, even polite. Drums played, flags waved, soldiers posed for photos before boarding trains. There were uniforms, but not yet mud. Marches, but not yet mourning. No one had seen the true cost. Not yet. The Union's Anaconda Plan was patient, but not everyone had patience. Some in the North wanted a fast, crushing invasion. Some generals preferred bold moves to slow squeezes. There were debates, frustrations, and political pressure to act quickly. So, while the plan was in place, it wasn't always followed. The South, meanwhile, held its defensive posture, fortifying strongholds, trying to protect railways and rivers, hoping that, in time, the North would simply give up. But with each passing month, each small battle in each skirmish along the rivers and roads, it became clear this would not be a short war. This would not be clean, and no strategy could fully predict the path ahead. Still, for now, the pieces were on the board. The North had its plan, the South had its ground, and both sides believed they were right. Right in their cause, right in their expectations, right in their faith that it would all end soon. They were all wrong, but that realization was still ahead, still hidden behind the hills of Virginia, the swamps of Tennessee, the forests of Georgia. For now, the strategies were set, the hope still high, the soldiers still fresh-faced and eager. The war was still in its early pages. So let's rest here, among the tents and maps, the quiet before the storm truly forms. The drums are silent, the rifles clean, the sky still blue. Let your breathing soften, let your eyes grow heavy. The war will unfold soon enough, but for now, you can drift. The war had a strategy. It had a plan. But now, it was about to meet reality. The battles were beginning. And the battlefield, cold, muddy, loud, was nothing like the maps drawn in quiet rooms. Because in 1861 and 1862, war stopped being an idea and became something real. The first test came quickly. In July of 1861, Union troops marched out of Washington. Their goal? A quick strike at Confederate forces in Northern Virginia. The hope was that this battle, just one, might crush the rebellion. It was called the First Battle of Bull Run, or, in the South, Manassas. Thousands of soldiers, civilians watching from hilltops, a sense of spectacle, like a parade that took a wrong turn. But when the smoke cleared, the Union Army was retreating. Wounded men stumbled back to the capital, and everyone realized this would not be easy. Bull Run was the war's first major battle. and it shattered illusions. There was panic, confusion, chaos. Both sides had green troops, inexperienced officers, and no idea what they were walking into. But it was the Confederacy that held the field, and it gave the South confidence, a belief that maybe, just maybe, they could win this. In the North, that early defeat shook the public. So they turned to a new leader, a general with neat uniforms, polished horses, and a talent for organizing troops, George B. McClellan. He was careful, thorough, and slow. Very slow. He built an army, a big one. He trained them, drilled them, prepared them like clockwork. But when it came time to move, to fight, to strike, he hesitated. In 1862, McClellan finally launched his grand campaign, the Peninsula Campaign, aiming to capture the Confederate capital of Richmond. His army crept through Virginia. They moved by water, by road, always cautious. And as they got close, the Confederates pushed back. They fought hard, defended their ground. McClellan, afraid of being outnumbered, pulled back, even though he had the numbers, even though he had the firepower. The opportunity slipped away. While McClellan hesitated, another Union general was doing the opposite. In the Western theater along the rivers of Tennessee and Mississippi, a different kind of leader was rising. Quiet, rough, unshaken by nerves. His name was Ulysses S. Grant. In early 1862, he began capturing key positions, forts, railroads, crossings. His victories were fast and decisive. At Fort Donelson, he forced a Confederate surrender. At Fort Henry, he took control of the Tennessee River. And then came Shiloh. The Battle of Shiloh took place in April 1862, in the woods of southwestern Tennessee. It started suddenly. A Confederate surprise attack at dawn. Union soldiers were caught off guard, pushed back, piled into a defensive line near a church named Shiloh. The fighting was brutal. Cannon fire, hand-to-hand combat, rain falling on red fields. By the second day, Union reinforcements arrived. The tide turned, and the Confederates withdrew. But the cost? Staggering. Over 20,000 men dead or wounded, more than any battle America had ever seen. Shiloh was a wake-up call. This war was not like the ones before. It was becoming something else. And then came Antietam. In September 1862, Confederate General Robert E. Lee took a bold step. He crossed into the North, into Maryland, hoping to sway public opinion, to bring the war into Union territory. The Union Army met him near a small creek called Antietam. What followed was one of the bloodiest days in American history. The fighting took place in a cornfield, a sunken road, a stone bridge. Thousands fell in just hours. The Union technically held the field, but neither side could claim a true victory. And as the sun set over the battlefield, it became clear. This war would not be won in one battle, or even 10. These early years, 1861 and 1862, were full of stops and starts, high hopes and hard truths. Generals tried new tactics. Armies learned by doing. And the country, both North and South, watched as sons and fathers never came home. The North had the advantage in numbers, but its early generals were often too slow, too careful, too political. McClellan organized, but didn't strike. Others fumbled or lost nerve. The South had bold leadership. Lee, Jackson, and others fought with daring, but they lacked supplies, resources, manpower. Every victory cost them dearly. And slowly war began to change. It became harder, harsher, more personal. Uniforms grew dirty. Letters became shorter. Towns were scarred. Civilians fled. What had started as a cause was now a constant presence. But something else was happening too. A shift in how the war was viewed, not just as a fight for territory, but as a struggle over something deeper, more permanent. That transformation would soon come to the surface, but for now the cannon still echoed, the smoke still hung low, and the rivers of the West ran silent between battles. The war was growing, evolving, like a storm gaining strength, and the next battles would reshape everything. But for now, you can rest here, among the slow-moving rivers of Tennessee, the quiet fields of Maryland, the soft echoes of drums in the distance. Close your eyes. Let your mind drift away from the battlefield, from the noise, from the names. The war will wait. Sleep does not rush. While armies marched and cannons roared, our life went on. Not in the same way, but it moved slowly, carefully across small towns, city streets, and lonely farms. The battlefield was only part of the war. The rest of it was happening quietly, behind closed doors. This was life on the home front. In both the North and the South, everyday people woke up to a world that felt uncertain. Bread cost more than it used to. Letters took longer to arrive. And almost every home had someone missing: a father, a son, a neighbor. The war touched everything. In the South, life was especially difficult. Blockades had choked off trade. Clothing became harder to replace. Food was limited. Coffee was a memory. Mothers stretched meals. Children grew up faster. Communities leaned on one another just to stay afloat. And through it all, fear simmered quietly. Fear that their towns might soon become battlegrounds. In the North, things were different but not easy. Factories buzzed with new demands. Women took up jobs left behind by men who had gone to fight. Railroads stayed busy. Cities grew crowded. There was more food, more supplies, but also more pressure. To support the war, to keep spirits high, to stay patient. Women on both sides became the invisible backbone of the war effort. They mended uniforms, tended fields, worked in hospitals, taught their children alone. Some became nurses, caring for the wounded in makeshift wards. Others formed aid societies, gathering blankets and bandages. And many simply waited for letters, for news, for someone to come home. Time moved differently in those waiting rooms. Slower, heavier. And those letters, they became lifelines. Scrawled in pencil, sometimes smudged by rain or ash, sometimes held together by thread. Soldiers wrote about mud, boredom, marching, and fear. And loved ones at home read them by candlelight over and over again. Some letters arrived months after being sent. Some never came at all. But still people wrote, because writing meant remembering, and remembering kept hope alive. Inflation crept into every pocket. Prices rose faster than wages. Confederate money lost value with every passing month. In the South, some families bartered for food, a bag of flour for a spool of thread, a sack of corn for a pair of shoes. In the North, taxes rose, but so did industry, new machines, new jobs. The war was transforming not just the battlefield, but entire economies. And then there were the voices often unheard, African Americans in both the North and South. In the South, many remained enslaved. But the war brought shifts. Some were moved from plantation to field. Others escaped, risking everything to cross lines into Union territory. Whispers of freedom grew louder. Some men were beginning to serve as laborers in the Union camps, guides, cooks, builders. Others simply waited, watching the war inch closer to their door. In the North, African Americans were free, but life was far from equal. Some worked in cities, porters, dock workers, seamstresses. Many supported the war effort however they could, donating what little they had, organizing communities, pushing for the Union to fight not just to restore the country, but to change it, to end slavery, for good. Churches became places of both prayer and planning. Schools opened in secret. A generation began to hope. They didn't know what freedom would look like, but they knew what it wasn't. And that was enough to keep moving forward. In the South, enslaved people heard rumors of battles, of soldiers in blue, of something changing. Some escaped under cover of darkness. Others stayed waiting, surviving, enduring. Every footstep in the distance could be a soldier, or something worse. But with each year, the distance between bondage and freedom narrowed. Life during the war didn't stand still. It shifted quietly. Children learned how to grow crops. Teenagers delivered supplies. Grandparents told stories to fill the silence. There were no parades, no fireworks, but there was resilience and an understanding that even if the guns were far away, the war was never really out of reach. Holidays passed quietly. Chairs remained empty at dinner tables, and towns marked time not by seasons, but by battles. They listened for names on casualty lists. They checked newspapers for glimpses of the front. And still, they baked bread, fed animals, lit lanterns. Life insisted on continuing. In homes, war was measured differently, by how long it had been since someone wrote, by how worn the shoes were, by how many days the flour lasted. The front lines may have moved, but the war lived in kitchens, barns, and church pews. It lived in the quiet moments, in whispers before bed, in the silence after reading a letter. And as the war stretched on, more people began to realize this was no temporary struggle. This was a change, a turning point. Whether they wanted it or not, America was becoming something new. The home front had changed. The war had entered every room, every town, every heart, and it would not leave quietly. But tonight, you don't need to worry about supply lines or uniforms or distant battles. You are not in a soldier's tent. You're not marching across frozen ground. You are home, safe, listening to the soft hum of a world that kept going, even through war. Let the flicker of the candle fade. Let the distant sound of boots dissolve into sleep. The battlefields are far away. Tonight, you are somewhere gentler. The Civil War had begun as a battle for unity, to bring the southern states back into the fold, to preserve the nation as one. But slowly, quietly, something deeper began to rise. A question, one that had always been there, one that could no longer be ignored. What would this country become if slavery still existed when the war ended? At first, the war was not about ending slavery. It was about the Union, holding it together, nothing more. But as the fighting dragged on, as the cost grew heavier, as the battlefield turned darker, minds began to shift. What was the Union? If millions of people were still in chains, what were freedom and loyalty if they were only meant for some? Lincoln himself changed, not all at once, not with loud speeches or sudden promises, but slowly, with careful steps, with long nights and heavy thoughts. The war was teaching him, too, that this wasn't just about geography, or borders, or state rights. It was about people, about lives stolen, about centuries of injustice that could no longer hide behind compromise. By 1862, the ground beneath the war had begun to shift. Thousands of enslaved people were escaping behind Union lines, finding shelter where they could, offering their labor, their help, their hope. Some began calling these men, women, and children contraband, not people but property taken from the enemy. But even that term couldn't contain their humanity. They weren't just goods, they were voices, and they were changing the direction of the war. In the North, people were divided. Some believed the war should remain only about union. Others had long wanted slavery to end, and now they saw a chance. Newspapers debated. Churches wrestled with sermons. Even soldiers in the field argued, trying to decide what kind of country they were fighting for. And through it all, the South watched, tense and anxious. Because if the North declared war not just on them, but on the institution of slavery itself, everything would change. Then came the moment that pushed the line. A presidential decision carefully planned, but timed with purpose. In early 1863, the Emancipation Proclamation was issued. It declared freedom for all enslaved people in areas still rebelling. Not everywhere, not all at once, but symbolically, the world changed overnight. The war from that moment on was no longer just about the Union. It was about freedom. The North had drawn a line and said, this fight is now moral. This fight is about human dignity. This fight has deeper meaning. The Emancipation Proclamation didn't free every enslaved person immediately, but it signaled a shift, one that could not be undone by, it said, slavery has no future here. In the South, the reaction was swift, a fury, fear, and determination. Leaders called the move unlawful. They feared slave uprisings. And they warned their people that this was no longer just a war over politics, but a threat to their entire way of life. In many Southern towns, the mood darkened. Every battle now felt like a battle for survival, not just for the Confederacy, but for the system they had long built upon. In the North, reactions were mixed. Some celebrated, cheering, praying, writing letters of thanks. Others felt nervous. Would the war become harder now? Would border states rebel? Would peace drift further out of reach? But for the newly freed, for those who had waited their whole lives for this moment, it was a quiet, aching kind of joy. Many had fled plantations. Many were already helping the Union cause. Now they saw a future they could walk toward. Black men began enlisting in the Union Army. Some were turned away at first. Others had to fight just to be allowed to serve. But eventually they marched, in blue coats, with weapons, with purpose. They weren't just fighting for the Union anymore. They were fighting for their families, their children, their right to exist as equals in the country they had helped build. One of the most important changes the Emancipation Proclamation brought was that it allowed the Union to be seen differently, globally. Foreign nations had been watching, especially Britain and France. Many of their people had strong views against slavery, and with the proclamation issued, it became much harder for them to support the Confederacy openly. The moral tone of the war had changed, and so had the diplomacy. The Union had taken a bold step, and the world was watching. Back home, African American communities in the North held ceremonies. They sang, they prayed, they read the proclamation aloud in churches and town squares. Not because the document was perfect, not because freedom had been fully delivered, but because it had begun. The war was no longer only about geography. It was about justice. It was about the future. It was about whether a country built on the idea of liberty could finally live up to its promise. Lincoln's views continued to evolve, not because of politics, but because of experience, because of what he saw and what he learned. The Emancipation Proclamation may have been the first step, but it opened the path to what would come next. An America where slavery could no longer exist, where freedom at last would become law. But that future would not come easily. The war was far from over. And the proclamation had, in many ways, raised the stakes. Now there could be no peaceful reunion, no simple surrender, because now the war had a cause larger than borders. It had a soul. Both sides understood it, and both sides prepared for what would come. In the quiet of winter 1863, as snow settled on rooftops and trees stood bare, families gathered by firelight. Some read the words aloud, others whispered them, unsure of what they meant. But in many homes, north and south, something had shifted. The war would go on, but its meaning had deepened. This was no longer just a matter of states. It was about humanity. Let yourself drift with that idea, that in the middle of one of the bloodiest conflicts in history, a moral light began to glow. It didn't erase the pain. It didn't stop the loss. But it gave the struggle new purpose, a reason for the suffering, a sense that when the war ended, America might become something better. Let that hope wrap around you now. Let it settle like snow on a quiet roof. Gentle, soft, persistent. Because from this point on, the war would not only change the country, it would change the meaning of freedom itself. The Civil War had begun as a battle for unity, to bring the southern states back into the fold, to preserve the nation as one. But slowly, quietly, something deeper began to rise. A question, one that had always been there, one that could no longer be ignored. What would this country become if slavery still existed when the war ended? At first, the war was not about ending slavery. It was about the Union, holding it together, nothing more. But as the fighting dragged on, as the cost grew heavier, as the battlefield turned darker, minds began to shift. What was the Union? If millions of people were still in chains, what were freedom and loyalty, if they were only meant for some? Lincoln himself changed, not all at once. Not with loud speeches or sudden promises, but slowly, with careful steps, with long nights and heavy thoughts. The war was teaching him, too, that this wasn't just about geography, or borders, or state rights. It was about people, about lives stolen, about centuries of injustice that could no longer hide behind compromise. By 1862, the ground beneath the war had begun to shift. Thousands of enslaved people were escaping behind Union lines, finding shelter where they could, offering their labor, their help, their hope. Some began calling these men, women, and children contraband, not people but property taken from the enemy. But even that term couldn't contain their humanity. They weren't just goods, they were voices, and they were changing the direction of the war. In the North, people were divided. Some believed the war should remain only about union. Others had long wanted slavery to end, and now they saw a chance. Newspapers debated. Churches wrestled with sermons. Even soldiers in the field argued, trying to decide what kind of country they were fighting for. And through it all, the South watched, tense and anxious. Because if the North declared war not just on them, but on the institution of slavery itself, everything would change. Then came the moment that pushed the line. A presidential decision carefully planned, but timed with purpose. In early 1863, the Emancipation Proclamation was issued. It declared freedom for all enslaved people in areas still rebelling. Not everywhere, not all at once, but symbolically, the world changed overnight. The war from that moment on was no longer just about the Union. It was about freedom. The North had drawn a line and said, this fight is now moral. This fight is about human dignity. This fight has deeper meaning. The Emancipation Proclamation didn't free every enslaved person immediately, but it signaled a shift, one that could not be undone by It said, "Slavery has no future here." In the South, the reaction was swift, a fury, fear, and determination. Leaders called the move unlawful. They feared slave uprisings. And they warned their people that this was no longer just a war over politics, but a threat to their entire way of life. In many southern towns, the mood darkened. Every battle now felt like a battle for survival, not just for the Confederacy, but for the system they had long built upon. In the North, reactions were mixed. Some celebrated, cheering, praying, writing letters of thanks. Others felt nervous. Would the war become harder now? Would border states rebel? Would peace drift further out of reach? But for the newly freed, for those who had waited their whole lives for this moment, it was a quiet, aching kind of joy. Many had fled plantations. Many were already helping the Union cause. Now they saw a future they could walk toward. Black men began enlisting in the Union Army. Some were turned away at first. Others had to fight just to be allowed to serve. But eventually they marched, in blue coats, with weapons, with purpose. They weren't just fighting for the Union anymore. They were fighting for their families, their children, their right to exist as equals in the country they had helped build. One of the most important changes the Emancipation Proclamation brought was that it allowed the Union to be seen differently, globally. Foreign nations had been watching, especially Britain and France. Many of their people had strong views against slavery, and with the proclamation issued, it became much harder for them to support the Confederacy openly. The moral tone of the war had changed, and so had the diplomacy. The Union had taken a bold step, and the world was watching. Back home, African American communities in the North held ceremonies. They sang, they prayed, they read the proclamation aloud in churches and town squares. Not because the document was perfect, not because freedom had been fully delivered, but because it had begun. The war was no longer only about geography. It was about justice. It was about the future. It was about whether a country built on the idea of liberty could finally live up to its promise. Lincoln's views continued to evolve, not because of politics, but because of experience, because of what he saw and what he learned. The Emancipation Proclamation may have been the first step, but it opened the path to what would come next. An America where slavery could no longer exist, where freedom at last would become law. But that future would not come easily. The war was far from over, and the proclamation had, in many ways, raised the stakes. Now there could be no peaceful reunion, no simple surrender, because now the war had a cause larger than borders. It had a soul. Both sides understood it, and both sides prepared for what would come. In the quiet of winter 1863, as snow settled on rooftops and trees stood bare, families gathered by firelight. Some read the words aloud, others whispered them, unsure of what they meant. But in many homes, north and south, something had shifted. The war would go on, but its meaning had deepened. This was no longer just a matter of states. It was about humanity. Let yourself drift with that idea, that in the middle of one of the bloodiest conflicts in history, a moral light began to glow. It didn't erase the pain. It didn't stop the loss. But it gave the struggle new purpose, a reason for the suffering, a sense that when the war ended, America might become something better. Let that hope wrap around you now. Let it settle like snow on a quiet roof. Gentle, soft, persistent. Because from this point on, the war would not only change the country, it would change the meaning of freedom itself. By the summer of 1863, the war had changed. What began as a short fight to restore the Union had stretched into something far more painful, far more serious. Thousands had fallen. The battles were growing longer, the stakes higher. And now, the war was reaching its hinge. A moment where the tide might finally begin to turn. Two cities, two very different places, but both carried the weight of the future. One stood in the east in the hills of Pennsylvania. The other along the slow, winding bend of the Mississippi River. Gettysburg, Vicksburg. And across just a few days in July 1863, both would shift the course of the war here, quietly, powerfully, irrevocably. Let's begin with Gettysburg. It was never meant to be the biggest battle. It wasn't planned that way. It started with a search, Confederate troops looking for supplies, shoes, food. They stumbled into Union cavalry near a small town. Not a capital, not a fortress. Just Gettysburg, rolling hills, open fields, stone fences, church steeples rising above a sleepy town. And then soldiers arrived, thousands of them. First a few, then more, then tens of thousands. 3 days. That's all it took for the quiet countryside to become a turning point. Day 1. Scattered skirmishes grew into full confrontation. Union troops held parts of the town but were slowly pushed back. Day 2. Reinforcements poured in. The lines stretched for miles. The fighting spread to hills and ridges, wheat fields, peach orchards, sunlight flickering through cannon smoke. Every movement was cautious, deliberate, a quiet dance of pressure and defense. By day 3, everything had built to a single desperate charge. Thousands of Confederate soldiers lined up shoulder to shoulder. A long, flat field stretched ahead. Union troops waited behind stone walls, high ground well defended. Still, the charge began. They walked forward, then ran, across open ground, under fire. It was brave, it was massive, and it didn't succeed. The line broke. The Confederates fell back. The battle was over. Gettysburg had ended. It had been the bloodiest battle of the war. More than 50,000 casualties across both sides. 3 days that scarred a nation. And it marked the first time the Confederate Army had been truly turned back in the North. Not just stopped, not just stalled, but pushed away. It was a quiet signal. The momentum was shifting. The tide was turning. Now, while the fields of Pennsylvania were still settling into silence, another moment was unfolding hundreds of miles to the south. Vicksburg. It sat on a high bluff above the Mississippi River, a fortress of sorts, guarding the waterway like a lock on a chain. For the North, taking Vicksburg meant cutting the Confederacy in half. It meant control of the river and control of the South's lifeline. But the city would not fall easily. Union forces had been trying to reach it for months. They moved through swamps, built canals, tried and failed and tried again. Then came the siege. Union soldiers surrounded the city. They cut off supplies. They dug trenches closer and closer each day. No loud attacks, just quiet pressure. Inside the city, families huddled. Food grew scarce. People dug into hillsides to escape the shelling. Hunger became constant. The days stretched endlessly. And then, on July 4th, 1863, Vicksburg surrendered. The North now controlled the entire Mississippi River. The South was split, and the Confederacy had lost one of its most important strongholds. It was a victory not of noise, but of patience, of quiet determination, of slow, steady siege. So now, let the timeline stretch out before you. Gettysburg in the east, Vicksburg in the west. Both victories within a single week. Two quiet, powerful signals that the war's balance had shifted. The Confederacy had not collapsed. Not yet. There was still strength. Still fight left in its armies. But something had changed. The North had found footing, and for the first time real hope. Not just hope for unity, but hope for victory. You can imagine it now. The quiet murmurs spreading through camps. The river is ours. The enemy's retreating. We can win this. Not loudly, not confidently, but enough to keep marching forward. Back in towns and cities, letters arrived slowly. Names were listed. Some survived, some didn't. The papers printed news of Gettysburg and Vicksburg, and though the headlines faded, the meaning stayed. The war was turning. Not with a crash, not with a single dramatic event, but with these two battles, 2 points of pressure that would send ripples through the rest of the war. The North would never again be fully on the defensive, and the South would never again advance so far into northern soil. Now breathe with that thought. Let it settle. A crossroads has been passed, and the road ahead has changed. There is still fighting to come, still loss, still weight to carry. But in these hills and on that river bend, the course of the war bent slightly toward its end. Let the memory of those quiet turning points rock you gently, like waves against the riverbank, like wind through the Pennsylvania grass. 2 places, 1 week, a shift in history. As the year 1864 opened, the war was no longer just a military contest. It had stretched beyond maps, beyond battlefields. It had become something deeper, something heavier. A total war. Not just armies marching, but entire societies straining. Every field, every city, every home now touched by the conflict. And at the center of this shift stood 2 men. 2 figures who would quietly shape how the war moved forward. One was Ulysses S. Grant. Quiet, relentless. He was not a man for flashy speeches or grandstanding. But when given full command of Union armies, he didn't hesitate. He understood the reality. This war would only end through pressure. Constant pressure. Not just defeating armies, but wearing them down. Everywhere, all at once. So he developed a plan. A broad, synchronized push. Multiple armies moving together across multiple regions. Grant would move against General Lee in Virginia. At the same time, another man, William Tecumseh Sherman, would begin a march into the Deep South. 2 movements, 2 fronts, and together they would begin a new phase of the war, one that would leave scars far beyond the battlefield. Sherman's mission was to march from Tennessee into Georgia, strike at its heart, take Atlanta, and keep going. It wasn't just about defeating enemy troops. It was about making war so exhausting, so unavoidable, that the will to fight would collapse. Sherman's goal wasn't to destroy the South's people. It was to break their ability to support war, to remove the tools and the spirit needed to keep going. This is where total war truly began. His men marched through Georgia, not quietly, not secretly. They burned railroads, melted tracks. They tore up supply lines, set fire to factories. They cut a deep path through farmland, towns, and plantations. Everything that could help the Confederate war effort was left in ashes. But even as this destruction spread, the deeper shift was psychological. Civilians watched the smoke rise. Farms were emptied. Barns collapsed in flames. The war was no longer somewhere else. It was here, on doorsteps, in streets, in the air. And yet, the army moved with discipline. It wasn't reckless chaos. It was a quiet, determined march, measured, deliberate, unstoppable. By the time Sherman reached Atlanta, the city had become a symbol. A key southern hub, an industrial center, a railroad nexus. Its fall sent shockwaves. And then came something more. Sherman didn't stop. He kept moving this time, eastward, to the sea. The march to the sea wasn't a traditional campaign. There were no long battles, no fortress sieges, just a steady, burning trail from Atlanta to Savannah. Everywhere the Union Army went, they left behind a message. This war was not just between soldiers. It was now woven into every life. And there would be no safe corner untouched. Fields were flattened, warehouses emptied, bridges brought down. And when the army finally reached Savannah, there was little resistance. The city surrendered quietly, a peaceful end to a devastating march. But Sherman still wasn't done. In early 1865, he turned north, into the Carolinas. Georgia had been harsh, but South Carolina, where the first shots of the war had been fired, would suffer even more. Towns were reduced to rubble, roads flooded, railroads twisted like ribbons. It wasn't spite, it was strategy. The South's ability to move troops, grow food, manufacture weapons was being erased. Meanwhile, Grant was pressing Lee in Virginia. Two armies locked in a brutal grind, one that never fully stopped. Instead of single battles, it was a campaign of pressure. The Overland Campaign. Then the Siege of Petersburg. Month after month, Grant pushed forward. Lee defended. Casualties rose, but the line held just barely. And across the South, something else began to crumble. Morale. Southern civilians, once confident, began to lose hope. The letters came slower. The food grew scarcer. The sounds of battle grew louder. And the victories, fewer. In cities like Richmond and Columbia, people whispered of collapse. Desertions increased. Supplies vanished. Inflation soared. Paper money was worth little. Stores were empty. Rail lines were broken. Many Southern families, especially poorer ones, simply tried to endure. They planted smaller crops, shared what little they had, and waited. Confederate leaders still gave speeches, still promised resilience, but the people were tired. Sherman's march had left more than a physical trail. It had planted the idea that the war could not be won, that this wasn't about one more victory. It was about surviving it all. And in the North, people felt the pressure too. The war was long, painful, personal, but they began to see light. Sherman's victories, Grant's persistence, and they started to believe quietly that the end might actually come. By the spring of 1865, and everything was shifting. The South was shrinking, its armies thinning, its cities burning. The Union forces were pressing from every direction, not just to fight, but to finish. The war had become total, a wide, relentless wave. And with each passing mile, the Confederacy was running out of ground. So now, let this moment settle in your mind. Not a battle, not a speech, but a slow, controlled unraveling, a march, a siege, a strategy patient, heavy and final. This was not a fast collapse. It was a long exhale, a slow motion ending. And soon, the final chapter would arrive. But for now, rest with this image. A weary Southern family watching smoke on the horizon. A Union army crossing an open plain. The ground scorched behind them. The war moving forward, always forward. As cannons thundered and armies marched, another war rumbled quietly underneath, one without rifles or bayonets. A war fought in newspapers, in town halls, in the halls of Congress. A political war, a war of ideas, fears, and choices. Because while soldiers clashed in the fields, the nation itself debated what the war truly meant and how far it should go. In 1864, with the war grinding into its fourth brutal year, the country faced a presidential election, a crossroads. Would the North continue under Abraham Lincoln, who now tied victory to emancipation, or choose another path entirely? There were many who thought change was necessary. Many who felt the war had gone on too long, cost too much, changed too much. These voices came together in a movement often called the Peace Democrats. Some simply wanted an end to the bloodshed, a negotiated settlement, even if it meant allowing slavery to continue. Others, more aggressive in their opposition, were nicknamed Copperheads. They saw the war as a mistake from the beginning, a power grab by the federal government, a threat to individual rights. In the North, especially in places like Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois, these voices grew louder. Pamphlets were printed, rallies held, accusations made. To many Union supporters, this felt like betrayal. But to the Copperheads, it was resistance against a war that had spiraled out of control. Even within Lincoln's own party, not everyone agreed. Some thought he was moving too fast on slavery. Others thought he was moving too slow. Some questioned the high casualty numbers. Others worried about government overreach. And through all this, the draft had become a deep wound. In 1863, the Union had introduced a conscription law, a draft. For the first time, citizens could be forced to serve in the army, but with one condition. If you had money, you could pay to avoid service, or hire someone to take your place. For working-class men, this felt like injustice. And in New York City, that tension exploded. The draft riots began in July of 1863, at first just protests. But soon they turned violent, very violent. Buildings were burned. Police were overwhelmed. African American citizens were attacked, targeted, and lynched. For days, the city was gripped by fire and fear. Eventually, federal troops arrived to put down the unrest, some of the same troops who had just fought at Gettysburg. The riots weren't just about the draft. They were about fear, about race, about inequality, and about the heavy, grinding weight of a war that felt endless. Throughout the North, resistance simmered in small ways. Some newspapers openly criticized the government. Some towns refused to enforce the draft. Some political leaders warned that civil liberties were disappearing. And to some extent, they had a point. To keep the Union together, the federal government had taken extraordinary measures. Mail was monitored. Dissenting editors were jailed. Even state politicians were sometimes arrested. The line between wartime necessity and overreach grew thinner. Lincoln and his advisors argued these steps were temporary, emergency measures in an emergency moment. But critics warned, once freedoms are taken, they are not always returned. This was the tension of the moment. Victory required sacrifice. But how much? Unity demanded strength. But at what cost? As the 1864 election drew closer, the future felt uncertain. On the battlefield, Sherman had not yet taken Atlanta. Grant had not yet broken through at Petersburg. Casualties were rising. Patience was fading. And Lincoln's chances of re-election seemed to waver. For a time, many believed he would lose. But then, momentum shifted. Sherman's capture of Atlanta in September 1864 changed everything. Suddenly, victory didn't feel like a dream. It felt possible. Support surged. And when Election Day arrived, Lincoln won decisively. A clear message from the North. Finish the war. Finish it completely. Still, the political divisions did not disappear. Peace Democrats remained vocal. Protests continued. And debates about liberty, justice, and federal power would echo for generations. But Lincoln's re-election meant the war would go on, not as a half measure, but to its conclusion. Not just for union, but for transformation. So as armies moved across fields, another kind of battle played out in cities and homes. one of ballots instead of bullets, of editorials instead of orders. And like the war itself, this political conflict was not simple. It was layered, emotional, personal. People did not just fight for or against the Union. They fought for what they believed America should be, what it could become. The country was still divided, not just North and South, but within the North itself, within families, within hearts. This quiet war of politics and protest was less visible than the battles, but no less real. Because wars are not only fought with weapons, they're fought with words, with ideas, with decisions made in voting booths or at kitchen tables. And in the winter of 1864, America had made one such decision: to stay the course, to endure. As the fires of total war still burned in the South, the Union had spoken with its vote. The message was clear, but the cost would still be high. The end was coming, but not yet. By 1864, the war had already stretched longer than anyone imagined. 3 long years of marching, of dying, of waiting for news that never came. And now, both armies were exhausted. But it wasn't over yet. In the East, a final and brutal campaign had begun. 2 generals, both seasoned, both relentless, now faced each other in a quiet, grinding duel across Virginia. Ulysses S. Grant had been placed in command of all Union forces. Unlike his predecessors, he did not back away. He did not retreat. He kept moving forward. Facing him was Robert E. Lee, respected, admired, and tired. The man who had once pushed into the North now stood defending his home state. Every mile mattered. Every decision carried weight. Grant knew what he wanted: to break Lee's army completely. No more chasing, no more long pauses. He would apply pressure, constant, suffocating pressure, until the Confederacy collapsed under it. It began with a series of bloody encounters in the wilderness of Northern Virginia. Dense forests, thick smoke, men fighting at close range, unable to see more than a few feet ahead. There was no glory here, only fire and confusion. The fighting rolled from place to place: the wilderness, Spotsylvania, Cold Harbor, each name a painful memory. Grant lost men, many, but he kept going. He refused to retreat, and slowly, step by step, he began to corner Lee. By June 1864, Grant had moved his forces south of Richmond toward a crucial rail hub called Petersburg. Lee raced to defend it. But when he arrived, the city was already threatened. So began a long, drawn-out siege. Petersburg wasn't taken in a bold charge. It became something else entirely. Trenches, mud, long lines of tired soldiers crouched in silence. A battlefield frozen in place. Men dug in, facing each other for months on end. It was not fast. It was not dramatic, but it was devastating. Life in the trenches was miserable. Heat in summer, cold in winter. Little food, rotting clothes, disease spreading in the still air. Soldiers wrote home about rats, about the stench, about the silence before an attack. A world reduced to narrow ditches and distant gunfire. And still the siege went on, month after month. Outside the trenches, the Confederate army was unraveling. Supplies were low. Railroads were crumbling, and morale was sinking. Lee could see it in the eyes of his men, the hunger, the weariness, the quiet knowledge that the end was near. But he held on, hoping for a miracle, or at least for time. Grant was patient. He didn't need a dramatic breakthrough. He just needed to keep the pressure on. Let the Confederacy starve. Let the army wear down. Let the siege do the work. It was war by attrition, and it was working. Meanwhile, Sherman was moving north from Georgia, cutting a brutal path through South Carolina, making sure there would be no safe haven left. The South was being squeezed from both ends. By early 1865, desertions in Lee's army were increasing. Some men slipped away in the night. Others simply gave up. There were not enough horses, not enough bullets, not enough food. Entire towns in the South were emptying out. Farms abandoned. Families gone. The Confederacy was crumbling from the inside. Lee tried one last time to break the siege at Petersburg, a desperate attack meant to slip past Union lines and flee west. But Grant was ready. He had been waiting for this. The lines broke. Not the Union lines, the Confederate ones. Lee's men began to retreat, heading west toward Appomattox, hoping to regroup, to find supplies, to keep going a little longer. Grant followed. This was not a fast chase. It was slow, tired, like watching two exhausted boxers leaning into each other. Each day, the Union Army moved closer. Each night, more Confederate soldiers dropped their weapons and walked away. Back in Richmond, the Confederate government packed up and fled. The capital of the Confederacy, once proud, once bustling, was now silent. Fires lit the sky as buildings burned. The dream of a separate nation was slipping away. Union troops entered Richmond not as invaders, but as witnesses to a city already collapsed. And still Lee pressed on. But there were no supplies, no reinforcements, no future. The end was now just days away. The final days of the campaign felt more like a slow surrender than a chase. Small towns blurred together. Skirmishes gave way to silence. Lee's army was surrounded. On April 9th, 1865, Lee met Grant in a small town called Appomattox Courthouse. He knew it was over. But that moment comes in the next chapter. For now, in this long and painful campaign, the war had changed. It was no longer about territory and no longer about strategy. It was about endurance, about who could hold on just a little longer, and Lee couldn't. This final stretch from the trenches of Petersburg to the dusty roads of Virginia was less about battles and more about collapse. The South stretched thin. The North determined to finish what it started. It was not a glorious ending. It was not fast. It was not heroic. But it was final. The war that had started with cheers and promises, and with parades and predictions, was now closing with quiet exhaustion. There was no doubt anymore. The Confederacy was dying. And just over the horizon, something else was coming. Not peace. Not yet. But something new. Something uncertain. One final meeting. One final decision. And then silence. April 1865. The land was quiet now. The thunder of cannons had faded. The long columns of marching men were no longer moving with urgency. There was just dust and silence, and the weight of 4 long years pressing down on every step. Lee's army, once proud and powerful, was now a shadow of itself, hungry, ragged, and surrounded. What began as a war for independence had become a march towards surrender. They had given everything, and there was nothing left to give. Lee had tried to escape west, to regroup, to continue. But every road was blocked. Every chance had closed. And so on April 9th, he did the only thing left. He asked for a meeting. That meeting would take place in a quiet little town in central Virginia, Appomattox Courthouse. Just a few homes, a few fences, a few trees swaying gently in the spring breeze. It didn't look like the place where a war would end, but it was. The house belonged to a man named Wilmer McLean. He had once lived near the first battle of the war, but moved here to find peace. Now the war had found him again, but this time for its final chapter. Inside that house, 2 men met. Not enemies, not rivals, just soldiers, both tired, both knowing what had to be done. One in gray, one in blue. Lee and Grant. There was no shouting, no dramatic speeches, no harsh demands, just quiet words, measured tones, dignity. Lee asked for terms. Grant gave them, kind ones. The war, at least in Virginia, was ending. Outside the house, the air was still. Union troops stood quietly waiting. Confederate soldiers sat in silence, unsure what this moment meant. There was no cheering, no celebration, only the soft rustling of trees and the weight of history pressing down. Lee stepped out of the house, mounted his horse, and rode away. He said little. There was nothing to say. Some of his officers wept. Others simply stared. The cause was over. The terms of surrender were simple and fair. Confederate soldiers could return home, their horses, their belongings kept. They were told to go in peace. There would be no executions, no trials, just an ending. That night across the camps, a strange stillness settled in. Some Union soldiers lit fires and warmed their hands, quietly relieved that they had survived. Some Confederates packed their things, not knowing what the road home would look like, not knowing what home even meant anymore. And yet, despite everything, there was no hatred in the air. This wasn't a victory parade. This was something else. A deep collective exhale. A nation pausing. The surrender did not immediately end all fighting. Other Confederate armies were still out there, scattered across the South, unsure if they should keep going or follow Lee's lead. But Appomattox changed everything. Lee had been the symbol, the anchor. And now, he had laid down his sword. The message was clear. It was time to stop. In the days that followed, more armies surrendered. More flags were lowered. The sound of rifles faded away. And slowly, gently, the war ended. For the soldiers who had lived through it, there was no going back to who they were. Men who had been teenagers when the war started were now missing limbs, carrying scars, inside and out. Their uniforms were worn thin. Their eyes told stories words could not. In the Confederate ranks, the surrender felt like a defeat, but also a relief. No more marches, no more hunger, no more watching friends fall, just rest. In the Union ranks there was pride, but it was quiet. They had won, but they had also lost. Too many lives, too much time, too many what-ifs. The cost was written on every face. For the generals, it was a moment of transition. Lee would return home and live quietly. Grant would remain, but never forgot how he had treated the defeated with dignity. There was a sense that, in this one moment, both sides had chosen grace. And what about the people? The women waiting at home? The children who hadn't seen their fathers in years? The enslaved men and women wondering what freedom now meant? This moment held different meanings for all. For some, it was the promise of a new beginning. For others, it was the end of a dream. And for many, it was simply peace. The fields that once held battles would grow silent again. The trees would bloom in spring. Towns would rebuild. But the echoes would never fully fade. The war had carved its name into the land, into the families, into the soul of the nation. Appomattox became a symbol, not of domination, but of closure. A place where war ended not with vengeance, but with a handshake, a quiet agreement between two men who had once tried to destroy each other. As Lee's army laid down its weapons, Union soldiers stood and watched. No cheering, no taunting, just silence, a gesture of respect. For soldiers who had fought hard, and surrendered with grace. It was over, not with a bang, not with a flag waved high, but with heads bowed, steps slowed, and hearts heavy. The war that began with hopes of a short campaign, that turned into years of blood and thunder, ended in a quiet house, on a quiet morning, with a few quiet words. Outside the house, birds sang, leaves stirred in the wind, and the world, after everything, took its first step toward healing. The Civil War had taken over 600,000 lives, but on this day, for the first time in 4 long years, no more had to be added. The war had ended, but the wounds were still open. Cities had been burned. Families were broken. The country had survived, but it had changed. And so had its people. In Washington, there was a quiet attempt to return to normal. The streets were cleaner. The air felt lighter. But it wasn't over yet, not really. The nation had won the war, but now it had to win the peace. Abraham Lincoln knew this. He walked the streets of the Capitol without guards. He shook hands. He listened. He smiled faintly. But beneath the surface, he carried the weight of it all. The deaths, the letters he'd written, the dreams he still had for healing the country. He spoke softly about rebuilding. He urged compassion for the South. No revenge, no punishment. Just a quiet hope that somehow the pieces could be put back together. But not everyone wanted peace. There were some who still saw him as the enemy, who blamed him for the war, who believed that his death might change the future. And so, one April evening, just days after the surrender at Appomattox, Lincoln entered a theater, not as a leader, but as a man simply trying to enjoy a play, to feel for a moment like the war was truly over. He would not walk out again. The shot rang out. The cheers of the audience turned to gasps, and within hours the president was gone. News spread like a storm. People wept openly in the streets. Strangers held each other without words. Flags were lowered. Shops closed. The capital went silent. And not just in the north. Even in parts of the south, there was disbelief. The man who had led them through the war had not lived to see its aftermath. Lincoln had become more than a president. He had become the symbol of survival, of unity, of something steady in a sea of chaos. And now he was gone. His body was taken across the country by train, stopping in city after city. People lined the tracks. Children waved small flags. Veterans saluted. Old men removed their hats and cried. It wasn't just a funeral. It was a nation trying to understand how to move forward. Back in the South, things were quiet. Too quiet. Towns lay in ruins. Railroads were torn apart. Fields had gone untended for years. There were no more battles, but there was no peace either. Just ruins and silence. Freedmen, formerly enslaved people, walked the roads unsure where to go. Some searched for lost family. Some found work, but freedom was still fragile. There were no easy answers. The Confederate leadership had scattered. Jefferson Davis had fled. Some soldiers still hadn't surrendered. The South was adrift. Economically, emotionally, physically, it had collapsed. And yet the future had to begin. Some Union soldiers stayed behind to keep order. Some churches reopened. Some children returned to makeshift schools. But everything felt different. Because it was. The war had changed how people saw each other. It had shaken the very core of the country. North and South weren't just lines on a map anymore. They were two experiences, intertwined but wounded. People kept journals. They wrote about the empty chairs at dinner, about the sound of birds returning to trees, about the eerie quiet, that followed so many years of noise. In Washington, Lincoln's successor, Andrew Johnson, stepped in. But the shoes he tried to fill were impossibly large. Lincoln had offered a steady hand, one people trusted. Now there was uncertainty again. What would Reconstruction look like? Would the country truly come back together? Even in victory, peace was fragile. For those who had fought, the transition to civilian life was difficult. Soldiers came home to farms that had vanished, jobs that didn't exist, towns that didn't welcome them. Some never spoke of the war again. Others carried it in their eyes for the rest of their lives. In the South, anger simmered beneath the surface. There were whispers of revenge, of resistance. The idea of freedom was real now, but the battle to protect it was far from over. Church bells rang for Lincoln. Towns held vigils. Newspapers printed black borders. And in homes across the nation, families sat together, wondering what came next. Some hung portraits of Lincoln in their parlors. Some recited the words he'd once spoken. Some simply sat by the window, watching the world move slowly on. His death had changed the tone of the aftermath. What might have been a steady road to recovery now became a path full of unknowns. He had wanted healing, but healing would take time. In a way, his passing mirrored the war itself, sudden, shocking, painful, but also deeply human. And so the country moved forward, not quickly, not easily, but step by step. The fires had burned out. The flags were folded. The generals had gone home. But the memory of what had happened would never leave. And the man who had held the nation together until his very last breath became something more than a leader. He became a symbol of quiet strength, of what it meant to endure. The war was over, and the president was gone. But the idea of America imperfect, fractured, and still searching had survived. And that was enough to begin again. The war had ended, but the echo of it never fully faded. Even now, the story of the American Civil War lives quietly in the spaces between history books and silent memorials, in old family letters, and in the deep soil of forgotten battlefields. It was a storm that shaped a nation, a storm that forced it to look at itself, to face its own contradictions, its pain, its past. It began with tensions, with compromise after compromise, with voices rising, cowed, then shouting, then marching off to war. At first it was about preserving a union. Then it became about redefining it. And through 4 long years, it became something more. A reckoning, a struggle for identity, a fight over the soul of the country itself. The cost was enormous. More than 500,000 lives. Brothers fought brothers. Fathers left farms behind. Children grew up with the sound of cannons instead of lullabies. And yet, through all the heartbreak, through the ruin and the grief, a new kind of America emerged. One that had suffered, but one that had endured. After the final shots were fired and the flags were lowered, what remained was silence and questions. Could the country rebuild? Would old wounds ever heal? Could North and South ever see each other again, not as enemies, but as neighbors? There were no easy answers. The years after the war were filled with new challenges. Reconstruction was a time of rebuilding, yes, but also a time of struggle. New rights were given. Old beliefs clung on. Some dreamed of progress. Others resisted change. The fight for equality, for justice, for unity, it didn't end in 1865. It only began again. But perhaps the most lasting legacy of the Civil War was its ability to remind us of just how fragile a nation can be and just how strong its people can become. It showed that ideals matter, that sacrifice carries weight, that democracy is not just written in ink, but tested in fire. The war changed how Americans saw freedom. It changed how they saw government, how they saw each other. From that conflict emerged new laws, new possibilities, and a new sense of what it meant to be part of a shared country. But it also left scars, wounds, some healed, some still aching, in the quiet corners of the national soul. You can still feel it today, sometimes, in the way people talk about the past, in monuments, in debates, in memories passed down through generations. History doesn't disappear. It lingers. It waits. It whispers. And the Civil War is one of its loudest echoes. But here, in the stillness of night, you don't need to carry its weight. You've heard the story now. You've followed the path from calm beginnings to rising conflict, to sorrow, to surrender, and now to peace. Close your eyes, breathe gently, and picture the world that came after, the fields slowly growing green again, the trains moving forward, the people tired but determined, trying to find normal again. The letters home finally stopping, not because the writers were gone, but because they'd returned. There were new babies born, new homes built, new songs sung, and new hope. Because even in the darkest conflict, there is always something left to rebuild. Always something waiting on the other side. The Civil War tested America, pushed it to its breaking point. But it didn't break. It bent. It struggled. It stumbled. But it held on. To unity, to belief, to the dream imperfect, unfinished, but still alive. And as the years passed, the country kept growing. New states joined. New roads were laid, new voices rose. Slavery was ended, but the fight for equality was just beginning. Freedom had a new name, but it still needed protection. Today, when we look back, we don't just see battles. We don't just see dates and maps and leaders. We see people, real people, living, breathing, feeling. We see mothers holding letters with trembling hands. We see soldiers staring into foggy dawns. We see children waiting on porches for fathers who never returned. And we see a country learning what it means to be whole. This is why we remember, not just for the facts, not just for the history, but for the humanity, for the reminder that no nation is perfect, but that every nation is made of people who try, who fail, who try again. And now, your mind can rest. You've walked through decades of story. You've felt the quiet tremble of old moments, rising softly through time. Let the echoes drift away now. Let the dust settle. There is no need to hold the war anymore. Let it fade like a distant thunder. Let it rest where it belongs in the past. You are safe here, in the quiet, in the calm, in the soft hum of sleep that waits just beyond this final thought. So close your eyes, let your breath slow, and know that while the war is over, the peace is yours to keep. No more battles, no more speeches, just stillness. Sleep well. The story is over.